Kia ora, welcome to this next tutorial. Today we're going to look at paper 91224 from the 2021 exam. This paper for economic growth. We're just going to do a walkthrough. I'm going to read the question. I'm going to tell you some of my thoughts about the question, some strategies that I would use to tackle this question, and some of the key definitions or terms or ideas that we want to use in order to get the highest grade possible. So Level 2 Economics 91224 or Economics paper 2.3. First question, aggregate supply. You need to know this like the back of your hand. Aggregate supply and aggregate demand are going to be in every economic growth paper. It's also going to come up in inflation, and you need to know it really well. Part of that is knowing these two concepts here, which are there is different components that make up shifts in demand and supply, or aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The one that's easy to remember is this top one, the AD equation, which is C plus I plus X plus G minus M. And then the second part is this AS equation, which is, we've got an acronym here, copy print, which stands for cost of production, P for population, I for imported raw materials, PR for productivity, IN for infrastructure, and T for technology. And that's not even comprehensive, but that's a good overview of all the things that might change or typically change that are causing shifts in AS. So let's crack into the question. I'm going to be looking for those things when I'm reading my resource material. In 2021, the minimum wage in New Zealand increased from $18.90 to $20, increasing workers' weekly pay by $44 before tax. Straight away, my mind's pinging here. More income, more consumer spending. Just like on the circular flow, more money flowing into that households means that they've got more ability to spend at producers. So my mind straight away will go to increasing consumer spending. So that's going to be probably my shift in my AD curve. I'm going to increase this C. And the next thing that's going to change for me, there are about 175,000 full-time workers on the minimum wage in New Zealand. So this says to me, okay, we're thinking about workers on the minimum wage. We're probably thinking about increasing cost of production. So the COP part of copy print, cost of production rises, and that's going to explain our AD shift and our AS shift, and we can be happy with that. Nice. Then to explain, which we're going to do in part A, to explain the shifts, we need to use our 4-point structure, our 4-sentence structure: cause, component, curve, consequence. So our cause, reference that resource material. Because of the increase in the minimum wage from $18.90 to $20, workers have increased pay. Full stop. Oh, have increased pay. Full stop. That's the cause. What's the component? This causes, right? So to link it to the component, this causes an increase in consumer spending as workers with increased income spend more on goods and services. Then we tick off that we're talking about one component over here. Then we talk about curve. How does the component link to the curve? Well, because AD is made up of C plus I plus G plus X minus M, an increase in C will lead to an increase in AD. There's two sentences in here. Therefore, AD will shift right from AD to AD1. And then our consequences impact on growth, right? This is a growth paper. We want to be talking about this axis down here, the growth axis. Tricky part here is that it's not shown AD shift on its own. It's shown in with the AS curve. So we're actually going to leave the consequence and we're going to jam it right in the bottom after we talk about the shift in AS. So we go for our 4-point structure again. Cause, an increase in the minimum wage for 175,000 workers will cause an increase in cost of production for businesses, because they must spend more on labour. And I've said cost of production, and I've said my cause from the resource material over here. So now I can move to curve. This increase in cost of production leads to a decrease in the supply curve from AS to AS1, as it is now less profitable to produce goods and services across the economy. Then we can talk about consequence, but we need to bring back that part from AD and down here as well. So my consequence is going to be a double header and say because, or both shifts in AD and AS combine to increase economic growth by shifting Y to Y1. You might say in here, because we've got those curves offsetting each other, offset's a great word to use here, you could say the increase in AD causes an increase in economic growth. However, this is offset by the decrease in AS, causing a decrease in economic growth. However, as the shift in AD is greater than the shift in AS, overall economic growth occurs, with real GDP increasing from Y to Y1. Nice. Let's go to our next page. A New Zealand salmon farming company would like to expand its operation. The initial investment would be about 35 million. It is expected to increase sustainable salmon production by 8,000 tonnes. It would provide valuable export receipts and is expected to create hundreds of new permanent jobs in the region, as well as flow-on jobs in other areas. Now again, to me, what sticks out big time here is the small shift in AD compared to the old ones. If I go back to the old ones, big shift in AD here, small shift in AD. So that's going to be something I'm going to come back to later on. Let's think about the answer to this question though. Provide an explanation for each shift, aggregate demand and aggregate supply, as shown on graph 2, resulting from the increase in salmon farming company expanding their operation. So we've already got the structure here, so let's talk about it again quickly. AD, we're talking about AD. We're not saying C rises, sorry, that's left over from the last one. We're saying investment, because it's stated right here, investment. We're going to say I is increasing. And then we're going to go cause. So refer to the resource material. We're talking back to the resource material when we talk about cause. The increase or the initial investment of 35 million to expand operations, or New Zealand Salmon is making an investment of 35 million. Next sentence to link to the component. We've talked about it a little bit. Make it explicit. This is an example of business investment. Next one, curve. Business or investment is a component of aggregate demand. State the equation. AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Lock that in. Because there is an increase in I, there is an increase in AD. This is shown on the graph as an increase in AD from AD to AD2. That's our curve. And then consequence, again, we're going to bring that back and talk about it after we talk about our AS curve. AS curve is going to be also increasing. So the increase in investment in salmon farming provides an increase in the ability to produce goods and services, specifically salmon goods, as production can increase by 8,000 tonnes, and hundreds of new jobs in the region, and hundreds of new flow-on effects, is all from the increase in output. So because they're producing more goods and services, now they're getting to this bottom section here. If I go back a little bit, we could actually probably include that into our cause right here as well. So we're going on the fly. So we've got I increasing. We could also have not A increasing, X for exports, X increasing, and that could be also followed through that whole path there. And then for us, for AS to AS2, investments going to be caused by, if we look back to the last question, which one of these copy print? Maybe not cost of production, but if we think about investment, we might want to talk about technology increasing, or we might want to talk about sustainable farm production. The initial investment, 35 million. We almost want to talk about resources here, which is not any of these things. We want to talk about resources that's not right. We want to talk about resources rather than any of these other things. And I've got a brush a bit funny. Or we could talk about technology. We kind of have to infer a little bit of knowledge here and say that the technology is getting, that 35 million is going to get spent on technology or some form of goods that are going to mean that we can produce more goods, some sort of capital that means we can produce more. So on our AES curve, it's shifting it outwards. The trick here is they're giving you on the graph. They've given you on the graph. So we don't have to be worried about, oh, but does it increase, does it decrease? Our job is to justify what they've given us because they've not done the graph wrong. We have to justify it now. So let's say increasing $35 million invested into business, increase in technology. We're better at producing with our resources, and therefore AES is shifting to the right. Therefore, AD is increasing, and then we go double for the consequence for AD, consequence for AES. Both of these shifts combine to lead to an increase in Y from Y to Y1. Let's look at the last part of the question, the compare and contrast part of the question. Explain why growth in the New Zealand economy may be greater due to an increase in the minimum wage compared to the expanding of the salmon farm operation. We've got to think about our plan here, which is to use these key words when we're comparing the impacts, right? If we're comparing the impacts, we're going to use these keywords. We're going to refer to the resource. When we're comparing, we can think about the size of the impact, the population, short run versus long run, number of industries, number of regions, different flow-on effects, effect on savings, the number of curve shifts, and then if the shifts are mitigating each other, there's lots of different aspects to think about. There's lots for excellence. There's also no formula, right? So in some of these answers for the achieved and merit parts, I give you quite a rigid formula to kind of tick off all the boxes. For excellence, there's not that same rigid formula. You do have to kind of follow the guidance of the exam question. Sometimes it gives you more, sometimes it gives you less. We just got to live with that. So here, the answer is, on the one hand, salmon is going to have a double shift, which is nice, for increasing economic growth. However, it's a small industry and it's a small number of regions affected in the South Island, right? Whereas, and then we're going to do that comparing word, whereas the increase in AD and AS caused by the minimum wage rising is much bigger. Huge percentages of the population affected, huge percentage of businesses affected, big flow-on effects all around the country. Comparing those two things is going to be quite different. So you're going to say, on the one hand, here's a little breadcrumb why salmon's going to increase economic growth. However, minimum wage much bigger. Therefore, it's the reason why it's going to have, even though it has the decrease in AS, that huge increase in AD is going to mean that the change is going to be bigger for AD and AS when impacted by wages rather than impacted by the salmon fishing industry. Right, let's go to question 2, ADAS. Make sure we got to lock those in. Lock in those, if I go back, lock in those equations. Lock in the quadruple C, cause, component, curve, consequence. Every time lock that in. Refer to the graph. Then when it gets to the excellence part at the end of it, you're only thinking about all the different ways something can be bigger or smaller. Follow the guidance of the exam. So it said maybe greater. Lock that in. It is greater, and tell me why, and sell it to the examiner. If they tell you the answer, it's your job to sell that answer. Don't give me half and half. Oh, maybe this, maybe that. I'm not too sure. No, they've told you. Push what they want to hear. Let's go to the next one. Impacts on economic growth. So we've got circular flow here. In my head, when I see circular flow and I'm reading the extract, I think straight away, identify the injection that they're going to ask about. Identify the injection or withdrawal, but probably injection. Computer game creators Grinding Gear Games and Rocket Works are examples of New Zealand technology-based exports companies in New Zealand. Their products include globally popular games Path of Exile and Icarus. Many people believe creative industries are the future of New Zealand. The gaming industry employs nearly 1,000 skilled workers with higher than average incomes. The industry generated over 300 million in export receipts in 2020, projected to increase to 1 billion in 2030. Output and revenue can be increased with minimal negative effects on the environment. Explain how a successful computer game industry in New Zealand impacts on growth using income and one of the injections in the circular flow diagram. In this answer for circular flow, we want to do this. Find the injection, export receipts, find the injection. Then, if it's going to producers, we want to see as quick as possible, increase output. Increase in output. Because that is increase in economic growth. If we look back to our last question, an increase in real GDP, an increase in output is economic growth. And it's the same here. Increasing output is economic growth. Identify the injection, link it to economic growth. So the injection is going to be here, increase in output. Then you want to bounce between household, producer, household, producer. Okay, so either go household, producer, household, or producer, household, producer. Find the injection, go to household, go to producer. So for this, it's overseas to producers, export receipts is rising, we're selling more goods overseas. Income needs to rise because there's increased output in producers. They need more resources, for example, labour from households, and will pay income in exchange for that labour. And then we get to go back to households. Households will use this increased income to purchase more goods and services from producers. This is consumption. Bang. The last step is to just link it back to growth. So we've done our injection or withdrawal. We've linked to the two-sector model, which is what we call this here. We link it to this economy of businesses and households. And then we do increased output because they're selling more overseas. And then link to growth, saying an increase in output represents economic growth. Or an increase in money flows represents an increase in economic activity, represents economic growth. Or an increase in X and an increase in C, both increase aggregate the AD equation, which represents an increase in real GDP. This is economic growth, right? Any of those things, but specifically, I'm going to put it in green right here. Output rising is good. You need to get to link to growth, which is increase in output here. You need to have increase in output. That's what's important here. Let's go to the next question. Part B. New Zealand dairy industry earns over $10 billion in export receipts each year. Over 40,000 workers rely on the industry for their income career path. There are concerns that the industry's impact on the environment is unsustainable. So the last one says sustainable, this one says unsustainable. I'm going to note that. Regarding waterways and climate change, increasing future revenue will depend on both foreign demand and adding value to existing products. The ability to increase dairy cattle numbers is limited. Compare and contrast. When they ask that, they want you to say however, on the one hand, on the other hand, this versus that, bigger than, smaller than. Compare and contrast the investing in the dairy industry with investing in the computer gaming industry as a way of creating sustainable, environmentally friendly future growth. One advantage and one disadvantage on investing in the dairy industry. One advantage, one disadvantage on investing in the computer gaming industry. Note that investment can be either financial, private or government sector, referred to the resource material in 6 and 7. What a long-winded question. And the answer is not sold to you. Right? What we need to do is, 1, read this question, compare and contrast. They want some things about sustainable. They want some things about future growth and with an environmental context. They want one advantage, one disadvantage of the dairy industry, one advantage, one disadvantage of the computer industry. It's up to you to figure that out. It's not something you're going to learn in a textbook. It's about using your knowledge from outside of the exam, outside of the explicit curriculum, to tell me some of that information, plus using your knowledge from actually reading the resource material. So this is part B. Advantage for the dairy industry. We'll start there. Advantage for the dairy industry. Advantage for the dairy industry is that the export receipts are sustainable. It's a very large industry with high export receipts and employs lots of people. So if you invest in this dairy industry, you're getting the benefit 40,000 workers relying on the industry. If they don't do well, you're going to suffer, or the government's going to suffer. So investing in the dairy industry, you're going to support those people. And then look at that number, 10 billion. And that's not a promise of 10 million. It's a real life $10 million. So it's a real life return on investment. Investing in there, it's already got a proven track record. Kapai. A disadvantage of investing in the dairy industry is that it damages the environment. And that's important for this question. This question is asking about the environment, and they're damaging the environment. So they've kind of given you the answer there. One disadvantage, invest in the dairy industry, it's damaging the environment. Another disadvantage is resources are already stretched, because they've said ability to increase dairy cattle is limited, which means, we have to go off track a little bit here, which means the opportunity cost for producing more dairy is going to be higher. It's more expensive to produce more dairy because we're already close to that productive capacity. Let's move on to the next one. And one advantage and disadvantage for investing in the gaming industry. And we can kind of say the opposite things. So one advantage is there's lots of room for growth, potential room for expansion. They don't have that problem of resources being limited like in the dairy industry. Plus, they're not that big, and there's a huge world market, so there's lots of room for growth. One disadvantage of investing in the computer gaming industry is that, well, we have to think again outside the box. Perhaps it's we're a dairy farming country. We're a farming country. We don't really have lots of skills to improve the technology in the gaming industry. So we might have to hire from overseas or find it difficult to hire. When we talk about the dairy industry, that's one disadvantage. Another disadvantage could be a risk. It's more high risk than investing in the solid dairy industry. Either of those ones can be fine. And then compare and contrast, you want to be saying through that answer. However, on the other hand, whereas, bigger than, smaller than, to take those two and compare them together. Again, in here, it's for excellence, this part here. Mitigating, offsetting, bigger, smaller, flow-on effects. Yeah. Follow where the answer leads. So the question's asked about environmental twice. Let's talk about environmental. Question 3. State the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP. My advice here is you need to revise. You need to get definitions locked. Real GDP needs to be locked. Nominal GDP locked in. HDI and Human Development Index and Net Social Welfare locked in. You need to just know those things, be able to define them. So when it comes to here, you get to bust out definition, compare, done. There's not a trick. There's no trick to this. So real GDP is inflation adjusted. Nominal GDP not inflation adjusted. They also, in this kind of style of question, which is like the asking the general facts about GDP, they might also talk about Human Development Index, which is measuring those non-economic factors, but it's a bit more difficult to compare, like life expectancy, infant mortality, health, happiness, all of those things. The next question, I think this exam was a bit of a curveball when they present to us this graph, which is our output over time graph, and positive and negative output gaps. Wow, that's tricky. What we had to do here was translate this into a PPF and say that positive output gap was meaning it was kind of like this here on our PPF. And they said a positive gap is when actual output due to high demand is greater than full capacity. So here is positive. Oh, let me do another color. Here is positive. Here's a positive gap. Here's a positive gap. And then negative gaps are here and here. So we're not using all our resources, or here we're using all plus a little bit extra. The question stated, the last question, using graph 3 and definitions on page 8 to compare and contrast positive and negative output gaps by explaining their impact on operating balance, revenue and expenditure. We have to call back to our circular flow model a little bit there. And the impact on workers, giving one positive and one negative. What's the plan? Follow those bullet points once again. Refer to the resource and the graphs. Use the keywords, however, on the other hand, whereas, larger than, bigger than, compared to. And then operating balance, think about inflows and outflows. Positive and negative don't have to be very economic things. So in this case, it might be economic things, but sometimes it's things like environmental factors or welfare factors. It's not always a directly economic numbers-based answer when we're talking about positives and negatives. For example, the questions about pollution or congestion in different exams. And then last one, this is the PPF question with a twist. It's not asking which is better. So it's the PPF question with a twist, a bit of a tricky one, and it took some real critical thinking to get this answer in the exam because it hadn't shown up like this before. The impact of the government on operating balance of the two gaps. What we're going to say here is at the positive output gap, we're producing more than we can. We're going hard as an economy, high growth, high output, high potential output. That means all the things that are good in life, right? Increased income, increased consumption, increased output. All of those things have a flow-on effect to increase revenue for the government, which is things like increased income tax, increased companies tax, increased GST, will all increase the government's revenue. So the government will be better off. Also, expenditure might fall as these people get increased output, or these people who have got the increased income are healthier, they're happier, they spend less on counselling, they might spend less on government health services, they might get their own health insurance, they might get off the unemployment benefit, which is going to be actually a bigger one. That's probably the main one, getting off the unemployment benefit. So a double kind of benefit for the operating balance, more revenue and more expenditure. But we're also comparing the positive output gaps to the negative output gaps. So we don't want to get too lost here, positive versus negative. When there's a negative output gap, when we're actually away from here, it's just the opposite of those things. Whereas there is underutilized resources, there's decreases in employment, there's decreases in income, decreases in consumption, decrease in output, and all of those things are worse off. So positive's good for the government, whereas, however, on the other hand, negative is bad for the government operating balance. Impact on workers, literally the same thing. In positive, you've got more opportunities, more job security, and more opportunities for promotion, increased consumption, more goods and services, less assistance from the government. On the other hand, when it's negative, you've got positives like, when it's negative output gaps, you've got negatives, which are all of those things. On the other hand, so saying negative output gap means that there's less opportunities, less benefits, more money from benefits, less job security, less opportunities. Okay, so comparing those two things, the positive, negative, comparing this, so using those keywords is very important. And that's the whole paper. So 91224, analyze economic growth, nail ADAS, remember those curves, remember these reasons for the changes, you've got your 4 C's, apply. Then did it again, compare and contrast, use the keywords, think about the different reasons why curves might be different, refer to the resource material. Circular flow model, Identify the injection or withdrawal. Talk about producers increasing output. Talk about households to get 3 flows or 3 sectors involved. Compare and contrast, same thing. Number of regions, number of sectors, number of industries. Refer to the resource material, refer to the graph. And then part 4, same thing. If you're not referring to the graph, not referring to the resource material, not answering the question on the bullet points, you're losing easy marks, which are going to take you to that next level. Those are what we look for in excellence, is being able to take the content and apply it properly. That takes using the resource material, the questions, and the graphs every time, as much as possible, to the point where it feels silly. Okay, we'll do 2022 next. Thanks for listening.